All right, here are some fun facts about the data supply chain. If data is a product, just like any product, it has a supply chain. So data providers get data from other data providers. Let's talk about this real quick. Let's look at some examples. Once you get deep into the world of data, especially B2B data, you start to realize that there are suppliers of suppliers. So while you, a B2B marketing or sales leader, might be consuming data from Clearbit, Clearbit's getting its data from LinkedIn. It's also getting its data from sources like Verum, Live Data, Oxy Labs, Mixed Rank, that also scrape LinkedIn. In some cases, when you go to a data provider, you're actually buying the same underlying data set. So a good example of this is both Apollo and ZoomInfo source many of their underlying mobile phone numbers from a company called People. What makes Apollo's numbers and ZoomInfo's numbers different or better? Maybe not all that much. So without understanding the fact that a lot of this data is kind of coming from similar or the same sources, most of people's opinions about B2B data providers are based on kind of like a gut feeling rather than a fact. So that's the kind of first bubble I want to burst. Second fact is that kind of as a result of this, all data sucks. There is no 100% source of truth for what accuracy is. For example, most teams, B2B teams, would look at LinkedIn and say the number of employees on LinkedIn is the most accurate version of number of employees. However, on LinkedIn, you go to a company's profile page and you'll see a lot of those profiles aren't actually current employees of that company. And some tools like Apollo scrub those out. So what is accuracy, right? Another example is that some data providers create made up values for things like annual revenue because they know that B2B salespeople and marketers really love to be able to filter by annual revenue. But where do they get that number? A lot of the times it turns out they're actually basing it off of the company's headcount and industry and coming up with a probabilistic value for what their revenue is. If that company's private, they're not publishing their revenue publicly. There's no way for the data provider to actually know what the company's revenue is. So you'll never have a 100% fill rate of these fields, especially if a data provider's taken a stance of, hey, if this is a made up number or I'm not sure about this data, I'd rather have the field be blank. Other data providers will say, hey, I'll fill in that field no matter what, because I know it's what my customers want, even if I'm not all that confident that the value in the field is accurate. Let's move on. Part of the reason why this is so hard and data is imperfect is that it has to do with something called entity resolution. Entity resolution is when you take records from multiple different sources and you have to figure out if those records are the same or different. So an example is, our company Primer has a Crunchbase profile and a LinkedIn profile. Both of them report slightly different numbers of employees. Which one is more accurate? This handling of conflicts is a big challenge. And then another challenge is actually just linking those two profiles together. For example, many different sources of contact data will link to, if there's two profiles of a person, they'll say Keith Delaney at sayprimer.com and Keith Putnam Delaney at sayprimer.com. They'll try to figure out a way of saying, are those two different people or are those the same person? And how they do that is typically through a join key. Oftentimes, like Clearbit, for example, seems to use email as their primary join key. Other data providers use LinkedIn profile URL. What if the join key is just sort of a classic first name, last name domain concatenated together, and there's you end up with like two people with the same name working at the same company. You could join that data set inappropriately. So that the resolution of these profiles is part of what contributes to some of the inaccuracies and it's frankly some of the imperfection that we just have to deal with in the world of data. And accepting some level of imperfection is kind of what you have to do. Another really important fact about data is that all data has a marginal rate of return. What does that mean? First and foremost, it means that looking at pure coverage and pure size of a database doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, what matters is the depth of data they have around your ideal customer profile. So if one database touts 1 billion contacts, another says 265 million, doesn't necessarily matter if the accuracy and count and coverage of the data within your ICP isn't there. It also gets more and more expensive as you start stacking data on top of each other. When we talk about marginal rate of return, what we're saying is that the cost of data provider 1 is, let's say $50K, it gets you 80% of the coverage. To get to 99% of the coverage, each incremental data provider is not going to immediately get you to 100%. It's maybe going to add an additional 10%, right? So it gets you to 90%, and you're paying maybe another $50K for that, and you're up to 100K. And then you want to get to, you layer on a third data provider, and that only gets you like 3% more. Now you're up to 93%, and you're paying $150,000. And then you layer on a fourth data provider, and that gets you to 95%. Now you're paying $200,000. You can see where this is going. At some point, you got to kind of ask yourself, is the ROI worth there for the fact that I'm getting less and less data for my money? What you should really aim for is as much coverage as possible and as much accuracy as possible within your ICP. Great example of what I mean by within your ICP. We have customers come to Primer all the time and look at, how many total companies are there inside of Primer? But when we look at what customers are actually querying and using inside of Primer, 90% of the audiences that are built in Primer only use 3.4 million of the companies. So only actually use less than 10% of the companies that are actually inside our database. Think about adding on or moving data providers. You should think about several facts. What are the trade-offs of adding in that additional data provider? Is it really worth it? If you're going to switch data providers, you have to think about what's the cost of transitioning, not just from a dollar standpoint, but what data might you be losing in terms of key fields or even values within those fields? Like, do they have a different industry classification between Clearbit and ZoomInfo? The answer is yes. And then the last thing you want to do is look at what's the real difference in coverage. Are we getting more or less from a coverage standpoint? In a follow-on post, we'll get into more of how to actually evaluate data providers and compare them against each other. But thought we could burst some bubbles and give a little more insight into the world of B2B data and how to be thinking about it.